Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. If you're watching this live or if you're watching this later, I'm welcoming you to a special edition of Talk the Tings. This edition is called Navigating Grief. It's going to be a three-part series on grief. And I am joined by my esteemed guests. This is Greg and Leslie. He has a master's of social work and he is a therapist, consultant, public speaker, founder of Educare Self Care Studio Inc. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Dee. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to our discussion on this enlightened topic.
Yes, anybody who knows me knows I have been dealing with grief myself, and so we're going to have the hard discussions, but we're going to do it softly.
Mhm.
So I'm going to put just a little content warning for everyone because we will be discussing death, loss, and trauma. We're going to be discussing a topic that a lot of people actually don't discuss, but everybody experiences it. And so our aim with these three-part with these episodes is to help you navigate a territory that most of us don't have a manual for, and to navigate and know that one, you're not broken, help is available, and whatever you're experiencing is real.
Mhm.
And so whichever end of the spectrum you will land on, because we will discuss loss, we will discuss grief, we'll discuss the different types of grief, because it's not necessarily someone passing away that will impact you. And you'll hear more, especially in this episode, as we ground you in the terminology around grief and ground you in the types and what it is and how it shows up. And in subsequent episodes, we will, delve a little bit deeper into the parts of grief that most people are concerned about. So as we go through it, I'll ask Greg some prompts. We'll try to keep it conversational. I'm your guinea pig because I would say I'm always grieving because I experience loss a lot ever since I was a child, Greg. And so it's always been something that I want us to address.
Mhm.
Like, I come from a culture, and Greg is similar culture background. Um, you know, I come from a culture where we don't actually talk about it. We
Mhm.
handle it in different ways. We do handle it but in different ways. And because of that, sometimes we have been sitting silent in our grief. Sometimes we haven't known how to process it. For instance, the recent loss I experienced may not seem as recent to some people. This year, May, will make 3 years since my dad passed. And it
Mhm.
is one of the heavier things I've been dealing with. And I only learned the term complex grief, for instance, last year, Greg.
Mhm.
So, and I identify that I'm living it. And so imagine having, experienced loss most of my life. Like, my mom died when I was about to be 6 years old, and it's just continued.
Mhm.
So there are times where I've compartmentalized. I put it aside. I don't deal with it. I'm
Right.
good. I'm
Right.
strong. I'm great. And then there are
Mhm.
other times it knocks me down,
Mhm.
and I'm not able to, articulate what is happening because I don't even have the words, much less the tools. And
Right.
so what I'm hoping is, in bringing in a professional in the conversation, we get to layer in some resourcing, some language,
Mhm.
and some tools to get through this better. Greg, how are you doing?
I'm doing well so far, so thank you for asking. And
Hmm.
thank you for sharing so much and for implicating yourself and being so vulnerable.
Hmm.
Um, just to address a few things you said for clarity for the audience, I would say grief is a journey.
Hmm.
Everyone deals with it differently. I
Hmm.
would also say it's natural because it is a part of life, and it's a part of life that the living or those that have to deal with it go through. I
Hmm.
would say when we're talking about grief, we're also talking about loss. I would say those are two different things.
Hmm.
Grief, I would say, is the process, and the loss is a thing that you're grieving over,
Hmm.
right? I would say, and those things, when we identify them, it could be loss of a loved one or a friend, loss of a relationship or property,
Hmm.
or just loss of housing or security, right?
Yeah.
So this conversation is layered as it relates to the type of losses that we'll go through.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these losses are also traumatic. You talked
Mm-hmm.
about and mentioned your own loss at a tender year of 6.
Mm-hmm.
So for you, like you talk about compartmentalizing it, sometimes that traumatic event leaves a timestamp. And
Mm-hmm.
then something we see, hear, smell triggers that memory, and then it all comes back and it opens the floodgates.
Mm-hmm.
And or we have other losses that may have multiplied, and for lack of a better word, it adds to the one that we've just had, and
Mm-hmm.
it just takes us a bit deeper. So
Mm-hmm.
just recognizing the symptoms of grief is
Mm-hmm.
important, and
Mm-hmm.
recognizing how we deal with those losses is equally important, just based on how you kind of identified it thus far.
Yeah, and I'm happy you chimed in there because that moves us past question one, and now we can go into question two. From your
Mhm.
experiences in therapy, as a therapist, what surprises people the most, you think, about grief and when they're going through it?
I think for each person, we all grieve differently.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of the nuances that come into this grieving is our identity, our culture, what resources do we have at our disposal? Because those things, I would say, intersect each other.
Mm-hmm.
And a good example would be, having to be living in a marginal situation, probably grieving and knowing that you maybe don't have any bereavement days or you have to continue to go to work. So those
Mm-hmm.
things, I think, impact grief.
Mm-hmm.
So really, the individual's identity and various things will impact how we do grieve. But could you repeat your question so that I'm clear on giving the audience what I know they want?
Well, I would also I would add to the question.
Hmm.
Is there a right way to grieve?
No, I would say it all. It, I would say we're all going to react to something differently. So our reactions are immediate, or, sudden, or they're gradual, right? So the grieving is a process, which is why I said it's a journey. So some of the grieving is going to take us through a continuum where we're angry, where we're probably in denial, we're probably in disbelief, and we're probably going through that cycle where we're questioning God, right? So that's like the cycle of grief that we go through.
Mm-hmm.
But in this process, for example, when we probably come to having to deal with it, there is, I would say, negative and positive signs to coping. So that's what we're talking about. How do we cope when we are dealing with this loss,
Mm-hmm.
right? Some people will drink. Some people would maybe not be able to eat. Some people lose sleep. Some people are overwhelmed. They're probably having intrusive thoughts. So a lot is happening depending on the impact of or the weight of the grief, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's because it's also situational,
Yeah.
depending on the type of grief that we're talking about. So I think there's a lot at play when the
Mm-hmm.
individual is dealing with the mourning around the loss that they're having.
Yeah. And I noticed you mentioned what a lot of people tend to be aware of is the stages of grief,
Hmm.
the traditional stages of grief,
Hmm.
which I know a lot of experts say it's not linear.
Hmm.
So you
Hmm.
might be in denial first and then not and then something else,
Hmm.
or it flips. In your experience with dealing with people as you counsel them, do you
Hmm.
find that they're concerned about what phase they're in, or they worry about are they doing it wrong?
No, I wouldn't. I would say most people, like to your point, what we identified as the stages of grief. I think, for example, I'll bring that as an awareness to say, like, when I'm talking to you and thinking about what you're going through, this is probably one of the things that I'm thinking about, like what stage you may be particular in, recognizing that they're not linear and you could be starting at any point. But for me, I am assessing the symptom, like what emotions are you displaying? Are you depressed? Are you anxious? Are you able to work? Are you able to do the things that you used to love? What is your state? How are you
Mhm,
coping? Right.
mhm,
And depending on the state that you're in, depending based on the grief, um, it really takes people a lot of time to get over. For example, when we're talking about loss of a loved one, especially if it's tragic and sudden. For example, gun violence, losing someone, those are tragic. So those, for a lot of people, They're thinking about the varied milestones because you lost a young child, you probably wanted to bury your child, and they don't get to go through their milestones of education, marriage, and so on, depending on what their lives were going to look like. If it's from an illness and that individual was old, um, I'm not putting it on a hierarchy, but there's some awareness to understanding that that person's probably lived their life and they're probably going to succumb to that illness. It doesn't make it easier, but it gives you context to be able to grieve in a way that makes it more rational, for lack of a better word,
Mm.
right?
Um, and so, talking about rationality,
Mm-hmm.
um, can you explain what happens in our mind and in our bodies when we're experiencing this loss?
That is a good question, because depending on the type of loss and the grief you're dealing with, if it's a traumatic loss, then trauma changes the body, the mind, and its composition, which leads to things like mental health, which could lead to depression or anxiety. It could lead to physical change like obesity or anorexia, because based on how you're coping. It could lead to heart disease, just based on, again, the reaction, of how you're treating yourself or how you're physically managing your stress. So when we're talking about this, I think one of the key points is grief could underliningly lead to mental illness or based on stress and depression, or it could lead to just physically impacting us depending on how much we're giving into the varied symptoms that we could have as a result of grief and the type of loss that we're experiencing.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that come up for people sometimes is some people cry. Some people
Mm-hmm.
cry and cry and cry, and some people are numb.
Mm-hmm.
What is happening there?
I think some of that could be the denial and the disbelief,
Mm-hmm.
um, and kind of coming to terms with like identifying a feeling. And sometimes the weight of it makes you numb,
Mm-hmm.
so a lot could be happening. And sometimes it could be you're so overwhelmed that you can't feel at this moment. And you're probably going through the motions of just dealing with life, but not really living, so you're drifting and probably having a lot of intrusive thoughts. So I think a lot is happening. But some of that would be conversational, kind of recognizing what that person is dealing with. Because for me, as I am unpacking the individual's grief in my mind, I'm thinking about the varied symptoms, and I'm thinking about what is the conversation I'm having with the individual and what are they saying to me to help them understand these are the various symptoms that you're having, based on the grief.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have a short term and a long term discussion around if some of these things continue, this is what it might look like. And if, as it continues, if it's a long term thing, this is what it might look like. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Just to be able to recognize, um, while we are grieving, life is still happening. So you probably still have to go to work. You still have to take care of your children. You probably still have to take care of your personal hygiene. You probably have to deal with some level of self care. Right. So oftentimes, individuals are just doing this because of their responsibility, but not necessarily, to your point, as being very numb because they're still dealing with the initial shock, which for some people it could be a day or a lifetime, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you're just expecting that that person will come to the door, or if that news isn't true, or you're trying to fact check it because it's just it's just unreal, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot at play as it relates to how you hear. Was it were you eyewitness? Was it direct? Was it vicarious? So I think there's so much to think of
Mm-hmm.
as you're kind of hearing this information, and dealing with grief, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, and for the benefit of those just joining us,
mhm,
know that we're gonna go into more conversation about that specific type of loss
mhm,
in subsequent episodes. But we just wanted to give you a base from which we're having this conversation today, not to
mhm.
overwhelm, but to kind of enhance your lingua around.
Definitely, and to provide some touch points
Yes,
around
yes,
what we're talking about, right? Because
yeah.
we want to identify that as it relates to loss, just to give some context, it's not just death, illness, or injury. It could be divorce, it could be separation, it could be breakup, it could be loss of a job, financial insecurity, theft or loss of property, culture, loss of culture through migration and language, loss of your dignity. There's so much at play when we're talking
Yeah.
about loss, right?
Yeah, I think I experienced multiple types of loss
Mm-hmm.
over
Mm-hmm.
my lifespan. Like I came to this country as an immigrant 20 some odd years ago, but I still experience loss from a from an intellectual space. I
Mm-hmm.
think about it in terms of there's a big cultural critic named Stuart Hall, and
Mm-hmm.
he said there's no going home.
Mm-hmm.
And that statement has stuck with me ever since I've come to Canada. There's no going home. I go home every year, visit
Mm-hmm.
my family in Jamaica. I touch the soil, but it's not the same. And I think I perpetually experience that loss. So it's interesting that you highlight that as one of the things that we could also grieve
Mm-hmm.
is
I would say
as
from a
immigrants.
100% from a cultural aspect, you have to adapt, to this what they would quote unquote air quotes Canadian culture, right? So you're adapting into this multicultural mosaic, which asks you to pivot. Definitely hold on to your identity, but pivot because there's a way of life here that you have to adapt to.
Hmm.
Yes, you'll
Hmm.
find your community and your village. However, there's a loss, in many of the things that you would experience daily.
Hmm. And so those things we can identify and maybe even flesh out. But what
Hmm.
about losing something that you never had? Do people experience grief around that? So I talk about things like your dreams,
Hmm.
dreams, goals, aspirations, or relationships that never happened, or
Hmm.
or some kind of expectation. Is there grief around that?
100%. I like the question. There's a book by an author. Her name is Bonnie, Bonnie, Ware, Ware. She writes a book called The Top Five Regrets of the Dying. And one
Mm-hmm.
of the regrets is not doing what you intended to do, but doing what everyone else said to do. For example, your parents said, become a lawyer. So definitely that's a grief. And
Mm-hmm.
most people who seek out their talents, their God-given talents, or do things that they get up and want to do every day, those people, in most cases, live a more happier life as it relates to kind of finding your talents and living your dream. But
Mm-hmm.
for those, a lot of people mourn that as one of the top five regrets, just not being able to fulfill what you would have because your life is hinged upon being responsible, and that
Mm-hmm.
responsibility that we're talking about is probably attached to an expense, right?
Mm-hmm.
So those
You
things
got to
in
pay the bills. You can't
yes,
live the dream.
exactly, right? Make decisions around, you know grieving, probably being a musician or what you probably dream to do, but thinking like, this is not, it probably better to sing in the shower than to say sing on the stage, because it's probably something you love, but it's probably not something that's going to pay your rent slash mortgage and put food on the table, as you kind
Mm-hmm.
of seek out those things. And many people wish they would have, if not even full-time, part-time, which,
Mm-hmm.
for me, that's one of the domains of self-care that I speak to.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also a parable that they speak of in the Bible, where God gives these three men their talents and he says, go and, multiply it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So oftentimes we don't live a life where we're able to, and oftentimes spend more time mourning those things that we never get and wish we
Mm-hmm.
would have or had the courage to take the calculated risk to do.
Right, right. How does grief show up for someone who maybe lost a job,
Hmm.
lost like health? I see especially women
Hmm.
dealing with loss of body parts to
Hmm.
cancer,
Hmm.
and a sense of even security. How do
Hmm.
people how does this show up for people?
So I'll add to that question. So examples of loss, and I'll
Mm-hmm.
use other examples such as infertility for women,
Mm-hmm.
brain
Mm-hmm.
injury,
Mm-hmm.
dementia, mental
Mm-hmm.
illness, and memory loss.
Mm-hmm.
So people, so some of the things that we're identifying, things that for a lot of people have underlining traumatic element, and it's things that I'm not saying people don't get over, but they hold on to
Mm.
for a long time. And as such, their attitudes are probably a bit more sullen. They're probably a bit more sharp and dejected because they're of the constant mourning and reminder. I think what we're talking about is losses. Probably from a good example would be being physically able and then moving on to being disabled. From
Mm-hmm.
being old, young,
Mm-hmm.
and vibrant, and then being old and in dealing with dementia or having a sudden injury where you have a loss, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you have a loss that reminds you of that loss through your body image, because for example, you'll see your reflection through the mirror. You'll probably, be told, you'll probably be dealt with different.
Mm-hmm.
So those things bring an impact where we're talking about mental health now, because now our self-esteem is probably impacted. So
Mm-hmm.
we have to now adjust and or pivot and get used to this now new identity or this new way of having to now govern ourselves because we're dealing with this loss, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't say it's again harder or put it on a hierarchy, but for those with a reminder, for a lot of people, it is a bit harder,
Mm-hmm.
just because of having to now, it's visible, is what I
Mm-hmm.
would say for some.
Mm-hmm.
So I think when it's you don't see it and there's a notion, it's not of much of an issue where it's raised. But I think if it's in a direct change where it's notable, then oftentimes it's harder because we're dealing with self-esteem, we're dealing with body image, we're probably dealing with a lot of intrusive thoughts around
Mm-hmm.
what we're thinking. We're probably dealing with episodes of panic attack or paranoia, just because of this onslaught of emotions that we're dealing with. We're probably dealing with a heightened sense of arousal. So there's just a sense of hyper vigilance in situations like this where we're just
Mm-hmm.
hyper focused.
Mm-hmm.
Example that I like to use with my clients with this type of conversation is just like we're all Peter Parker, we're all Spider-Man, right? So Spider-Man's superpower is his paranoia. It's just like hyper arousal, just impending danger. And
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes, when we're in this state, we just can't turn off that hyper focus sensation
Mm-hmm.
just because it's so intrusive. And
Yeah.
oftentimes that's what leads to people's anxiety because they just can't shut it off.
Mm-hmm.
And for some people, that's what shifts them to the post-traumatic stress, depending on what's happening.
Yeah. I mean, I can implicate myself in this conversation as it relates to hair loss.
Mm-hmm.
I've been dealing with alopecia, and I've had to give up on hair recovery.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I shouldn't give up, but I did. And but identity was so impacted,
Mm-hmm.
because when I look in the mirror, I don't recognize the person that was there.
Mm-hmm.
And I've done things to um, adjust,
Mm-hmm.
like enhance aspects of myself. So I have, these lovely glasses that,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
people think are now a trademark, but
They are. You're always styling. I admire that about you, right? And I would have never known unless we started to unpack things like this, right?
yeah, yeah. So, but it came from, yeah, I've always liked nice glasses, but it came from, oh, I need to be able to feel nice
Mm-hmm.
again,
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
feel um,
Confident. Mm-hmm.
confidence.
Mm-hmm.
My idea of beauty and femininity were shattered,
Mm-hmm.
because I come from a very patriarchal culture
Mm-hmm.
where bald women are not seen as feminine.
Mm-hmm.
And so I continue to challenge that, but I also continue to battle with
Mm-hmm.
that femininity thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I resonate with the Peter Parker analogy that you give, because
Mm-hmm.
I am hyper vigilant. Like,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes people greet me and they touch my head. They never used to
Mm-hmm.
touch my head when I had hair. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, why are you doing that? And so I'm
Mm-hmm.
very, on edge. And a lot of people won't know that, right? Because
Right.
that's the other thing with grief too.
Mm-hmm. 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 But
It's
you've named so many,
silent.
but you've named your grief so well because you recognize what it is. But there were so many other parts of your grief that
Hmm.
impacted your identity as a
Hmm.
woman. right?
Mm-hmm.
As you
Mm-hmm.
talked about the loss of questioning your femininity,
Mm-hmm.
having to question the patriarchal views of the culture that you come from. So
Mm-hmm.
all of those are losses or things
Mm-hmm.
that you now have to identify just based
Mm-hmm.
on your own loss. And I think
Mm-hmm.
these, when we talk about loss, we recognize, for example, we stub our toe, but realize it's so hard to walk now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, just this one thing makes such a huge shift in our life,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So it just recognizes how important it could be when we unpack it and identify the different domains of what you're talking about, to
Mm-hmm.
realize this healing journey is not just me using you as an example, my hair loss, but how
Mm-hmm.
many other things it disrupted and how many
Mm-hmm.
things that I now have to balance within myself
Mm-hmm.
as I intersect the world, right?
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, and this kind of segues to another thing that we wanted to talk about is culture,
Mm-hmm.
culture and grief, because we're identifying that people might grieve differently depending on their culture. And I want to play a bit of a video
Mm-hmm.
that shows how our culture, because we're Jamaican,
Yes.
how our culture sometimes deals with loss and grief.
Mm-hmm.
And it's called a 9 night, and we'll talk about it on the other end. So that was a clip from a 9 night that could happen in anywhere Jamaica,
Mm-hmm. It's
literally
true.
in anywhere Jamaica, but mostly in the rural parishes. Is that tradition still very strongly kept?
Mm-hmm.
Where the ninth night after the passing of someone, the community comes out, the family and community comes out, and the person you saw on the mic was a hired band person. They hire a whole band, and
Mm-hmm.
that band will go all night. I was fortunate to experience it in multiple ways, but also with a family loss.
Mm-hmm.
And that band, I don't know where they get the energy from. They went from 6 to 6 a.m., and we
Mm-hmm.
had the funeral the next day. So um but for those who don't know, that tradition, there's singing, there's dancing, and it seems like revelry. um if you were able to pan over, you would see that there's tents where there's food being served as well. And so a lot of things go into the tradition, like there's pouring of libation in some instances, which is harkening back to our African culture. But there's also, so there's rum always present at a 9 night,
Mm-hmm.
for libation purposes and drinking. And then there's that seeming revelry. But other cultures do different things with grief. That's just our example of how culture may handle grief. What has been, your take on the cultural impact of grief?
Very, I would say, important question. I think I want to do it justice, so I think it's a conversation within itself. But let's give a smid bit. I think for myself, I was able to experience, as an adult, the 9 night when my grandparents transitioned in 2006, my grandfather in 2009, my grandmother. So to your point, each culture kind of has their own. But what I would say, just reflecting on the Jamaican and the African culture for a minute, comparing the two, is that transition of helping that person to transition onto the other side. And I know that there's stories connected to that where we're talking about the rolling calf, ensuring the destination to the burial ground and so on. So there's so much that goes into culture and tradition when we're talking about culture and loss. I
Mm-hmm.
know for individuals in the Islam slash Muslim faith, they bury their individuals the day after.
Mm-hmm.
I know, for example, from the Osar, Aset, and people in the Kemetic faith, for example, they do a 40-day, they do 9 reiterations of 40-day fast and observation and meditation to transition their individual. I know
Mm-hmm.
as an Orthodox, baptized Orthodox, we do the 40-day as well. So there's many traditions. I
Mm-hmm.
think in essence, individuals just want to ensure that that person has transitioned well.
Mm-hmm.
I think in my dealing with loss, um, individuals that are connected to some faith or grounded to some religion, um, oftentimes that has fortified them and given them the capacity to deal with death and loss a bit more,
Mm-hmm.
just based on their connection to understanding, it's a part of life and it's natural.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say that their loss is different. It just grounds them in recognizing there's hope depending on individual belief. Let me say
Mm-hmm.
that. And I think those things come into play when we're
Mm-hmm.
talking about loss. So when we're talking about culture, I think there's a lot to consider. Some
Yeah.
of the hidden things that we also need to think about culture when we talk about culture are social determinants like income impact, what kind of funerals we're going to have. I know within a lot of individuals that die suddenly, may not be able to aloft or afford a burial through a casket. So oftentimes, there's cremation has to be considered. So I
Mm-hmm.
think there's a lot we're talking about loss, specifically death right now, that goes into
Yeah.
that whole process,
Yeah.
to having to arrange the individual. So all of those nuances for a second um, are different within the cultural aspect, right?
Yeah.
When we're talking about it.
I find, and this is from my personal observation, I find that culture and cultural expectations might actually complicate the grief
Mm-hmm.
because you're meeting with the expectation to do certain things. So like we in traditional Jamaican setting would do a 9 night, but not everybody did a 9 night.
Mm-hmm.
But in the expectation of doing a 9 night, nobody talked about the expense,
Mm-hmm. Right.
right?
Right.
You're feeding the whole community.
Yeah.
You're bringing in a band, you have to pay the band, you're doing
Mm-hmm.
all these other things plus the burial.
Right.
And I find a lot of cultures do something around food and liquid,
Mm-hmm.
whether it is rum or other liquid. There's some kind of maybe offering
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
to the
Mm-hmm.
to the person to transition, making sure they have everything they need for their journey, I guess,
Correct. Mm-hmm.
in how they interpret it. So we may cover that piece,
Mm-hmm.
but there's another piece, Greg, that sits with me badly.
Mm-hmm.
It's the piece where we don't talk. So we do all this other stuff, the
Mm-hmm.
outside appearance of the grieving, where
Mm-hmm.
we're bringing the offering, having the altar, or whatever the case may be in your culture, but
Mm-hmm.
we didn't discuss the loss. we
Mm-hmm.
did as a matter of fact, we may even be ushered to move along.
Mm-hmm.
And I speak from experience in this. When my dad passed away in 2023, I stayed in Jamaica like since the day after his death until his burial,
Mm-hmm.
because it didn't make sense to do the back and forth thing. So I was literally working from Jamaica and dealing with, you know, leading up to the funeral and so on.
Mm-hmm.
I get back to Canada and somebody from our culture says to me, "Oh, so you're done with all that stuff now with your dad, right?" I I don't know how I didn't cuss them out. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
who was
Mm-hmm.
walking with me that day, but it was as if, okay,
Get over it.
wrap it up now,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
put it in a
Mm-hmm.
nice bow,
Right.
let's move on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that happens in several cultures.
Correct.
Especially when you're hasty to do the burial.
Mm-hmm.
I think cultures that take some days with it may have a little bit more nuance.
Mm-hmm.
But do you find that people who are dealing with grief, even that cultural lens plays a part?
It definitely does. And I think to be clear, what we're talking about is giving space to mourn, kind of in naming it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, some don't want to stay in that place because it's taboo. It may be gendered. And I think, these things do come into question, where it's ushered fast. Some maybe it might be situational. The death, for example, might have brought disgrace on the family and or the
Mm-hmm.
culture. So these things, as we give examples, different cultures make different decisions about it. Um, some cultures, as we're talking about cultures, we're talking about nuances, and connection to physically being above the earth, and then spiritually, depending on what that separation looks like. Not trying to
Mm-hmm.
name it, and also trying to be sensitive and with respect to
Mm-hmm.
everyone's beliefs around the transition of the spirit, dealing with the physical loss of death is different. Where some believe, again, not trying to name it for people, that there's an afterlife and they will be reunited. Some believe that is the end. Some believe that, what, that is one iteration of their life. So I think all those things come into play, where, for example, an individual, you might feel like it's just so cut and dry, is because maybe they're attached to, like, I'll see you again someday somehow, so I don't necessarily have to mourn. While others, depending on the level of relationship, um, can let go. I could implicate myself in that when my
Mm-hmm.
both grandparents for me passed in, as I said, 2006 and 2009. Being an adult, as much as I knew one day they would succumb to death based on age and illness, it impacted me. It still does to this day. Still
Mm-hmm.
call my grandmother's name and grandfather's name, just based on values and the level of relationship
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that I had with them, and just being, one of the grandchildren that were the apple of their eye, and just being able to read and, write their will and do their eulogy. All of those things, just based on my connection to that process, just implicated myself in their lives deeper. So I think it's a level of relationship, level of cultural awareness, level of um, understanding around the ritual and what that would look like. And I'm calling it a ritual, or like the ceremony. All
Mm-hmm.
of those things, come into to play
Mm-hmm.
um, for the individuals when they decide that we're going to, follow this process. And it's very meaningful, while some are not given meaning just based on resource, I think
Mm-hmm.
comes into play. Others are because of the expectation, like, of having to do it, where, you gave the example of the nine night, there's a lot of resources monetarily that goes into it that are missed, but it becomes an expectation just based on culture, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
While a lot of individuals that I have seen, talking about a Canadian context, when it's sudden, there are GoFundMe's that go out that have to support the family. So when we're
Mm-hmm.
talking about these things, determinants have to do a lot with it. And when we talk about grief and loss, a lot of individuals in our community um, may not have life insurance or insurance to support that process. So I
Mm-hmm.
know we're giving a little tidbits of everything that could be unpacked, but I
Mm-hmm.
think all of these things are a part of the conversation that needs to be considered when we're talking about it. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we're not prepared for it because
Mm-hmm.
it's such a nuanced conversation. It's over there,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
When
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about this, we're talking about the funeral process, the need to probably have a will, the need to probably, understand what type of burial or ritual you will want when you pass or transition, as we're talking about this example, right? So
Yeah.
all need to be considered within the culture. And you might be complicated a bit. You might come from a culture where is expected that you might do this, but you form the life of your own, and you may not want none of these things.
Right.
So, right. So there's a lot at play when
Mm-hmm.
we're
Mm-hmm.
talking
Mm-hmm.
about these things, where, to your point, if the discussion is not had, how do we come to some consensus?
Yeah, yeah. And so many layers can come from that, right? Because if
Hmm.
you are now seen to betray the cultural practice, do you now outcast yourself in the process of even grieving on your own terms, or
Hmm.
what I mean? So there is much there to unpack. I want to bring our community in,
Hmm. Hmm.
because there is a type of grief that we will kind of flesh out a little bit more, and it's the collective or social grief.
Hmm.
And I speak about some things that I'll show some video clips for. Um, to put in context, we have not, I think, as a group of people, as humans, contended with COVID. We went through a pandemic, but I don't think we've had the conversation. We haven't met around the bobab tree. We haven't done the conversation. So I'm gonna show two things as it relates to Corona, and we'll talk a little bit more about that.
On this Wednesday night, the coronavirus officially reaches pandemic proportions. What it means and what it calls for.
This is a call to action and a call not to give up.
As more countries, including Canada, make plans to act.
We will make sure you have everything you need.
Are Canadian hospitals equipped to cope as the health minister spells out the worst case scenario?
It's safe to assume that it could be between 30% and 70% of the population.
Social distance.
Remember that memory lane? Here's another element of it, and this is a little bit more intense.
Guys, we need some help in here now.
Don't fight, baby. Mr. Ellis, you hang in there. It's up to the clock. You're too awake. That's what it is. Come on, buddy. We're going to put you back to sleep. One more. All right?
It's okay, bud. Mr. Ellis has had a persistent fever and was breathing really, really fast.
It's all right. It's all right, honey. I don't want you to be too awake while you're having this tube in your mouth.
So we had to put him back on the ventilator.
He was the only one. Like, I kept looking at him, and every time I look at him, I see those little kids, and I needed him to do well.
In pulling together these things, of course, it re-triggered me because the early part of COVID was intense. If anybody remembers, I showed you the news clip because I want you to remember that time where we collectively can recall where we were when they declared it a global pandemic. You know what I mean? Right. And a lot of loss happens that way that we all can remember. It's 9/11. We can all remember where we were. How does this, affect us individually to experience this collective grief moment?
So one of the things that in naming this collective grief, where we're all kind of simultaneously feeling it at the same time, is that I think you made a key point, which was we could all remember where we were and probably what we're doing. And the key thing to mention here is that when it's a traumatic event, like both of what you mentioned, it leaves a timestamp, right? So that timestamp now is triggered by various things. For example, things we see, things we smell, things we hear. So your senses come into play, which brings back that memory or that trigger or that flashback or that moment.
Yeah, so somebody said in a meeting that if he hears people cough, he's triggered.
Exactly. So COVID is so vivid that there's so many different trigger and touch points that brings us back to that it's like that constant mourning of like we all shifted and went through a new trajectory together because life, in essence has never been the same since. Right. So to your point, collectively, we've had to adjust to at one time wearing masks. Ensuring to social distance by a particular feed. So all of those things, conditioned us on how to move and how to react collectively as we're now dealing with, the changes that are happening as a result of this huge change, this huge loss of like what life was. And, a good example is during COVID, we were like, what are we going to do for work and how are we going to cope? And we went to shift from a hybrid model of working from home. And now we're shifting back to people having to go to work. And it's a new upcry. Yeah. Right. So I think it's just to say, collectively we shift and adapt and pivot together. and mourn together.
But what has been the individual toll? Because we're both in the healthcare sector. You're a clinician, I'm an administrator. And I feel like there's been an uptick in mental health
yes,
occurrences since COVID. What are some of the ways that we saw
I would
this
say
collective thing
I would.
impacting?
Well, it's the trigger, right? So one of the things to say often. So let me lead by saying we all have mental health, but our mental health may not become mental illness. And I think COVID, based on the magnitude and its impact, its emergence led to a lot of individuals dealing
having
with illnesses. Whether those be as it relates to COVID. Or as it relates to the traumatic effect, impact of job loss, just a shift in how society was moving, right? So a lot of people started to experience anxiety and depression as a result of that. So it's just life before COVID was predictable. So that unpredictability is what led to your point, an emergence on the uptick of what was happening, what are we going to do? So this emergence of the unknown or the ambivalence is hard for people to live in that place, because it's easier to be predictable, to know I'm going to go to work, I'm going to go home and come home and I'll be able to pay my rent. But in COVID, it's just like life was up in the air. Like, what do I do now? So we're mourning this unpredictability because I don't know what's going to happen minute to minute, second to second. And then there's hyper vigilance in the beginning around, like, if you go outside, I'm not saying that this is the case, you could potentially die, right? Because there's this looming homogeny around death, right? That was looming for a lot of people. So how do we navigate this space?
And some people came out of it, and some people are still quite paranoid.
Definitely. So what happens as well, again, I know we're naming again different touch points. Oftentimes when things like this, we're in a paradigm shift. So some people are still in 2019 and will not recover, even though we're in 2026. We're stuck. Like it's that traumatic impact again, where we're just not able to move or adjust to life as it is right now because of all that has happened, right? So it's for me. Shameless plug, but I went into private practice in 2016. And when COVID came, that's when my work blossomed, to be very honest, because of the uptick. So for me, it was scary because it's like, wow, the world has become so vulnerable. Like, we don't know how to process, self-regulate, which were some of the common things where a lot of people were just anxious just because of the unknown and being able to talk them off the ledge as a result of like, life essentially, there's parts of life that are systemic that won't change. But there was no predicting that until, for a lot of people, they came on the other side of that. Right. So I think a lot of people could live vicariously and be okay. But for a lot of people in circumstances like that, the unknown is too much to bear with or to live through. Right? So there emerges different things, whether it be physical health, mental health, or just it being impacted spiritually, or just loss of what life was, which is kind of what we're talking about, right?
Yeah, I wanna enhance this collective conversation or social grief conversation with another thing that happened in 2020.
Despite being handcuffed, Floyd appeared agitated and resisted getting into the back of the squad vehicle, citing claustrophobia.
I'm claustrophobic, officer. The door. Man. I hear you, but you are going to face this door right now. Stop. I'll do anything. I'm leaving out everything, man. I'm not resisting, man.
This behavior was somewhat puzzling, as Floyd had been sitting in a vehicle when the officers approached him. At this stage, officers were unsure why Floyd was acting the way he was. Officer Queng, in particular, seemed nervous as he handled Floyd. Even though Floyd was handcuffed, Queng can be heard saying he is nervous because Floyd is reaching to his side.
Yeah, look at you still able to reach your side. You're making me nervous.
This interaction highlighted the tense stance police officers had when dealing with George Floyd.
So, George Floyd, a I would say a turning point, although we seem to be retracting. But it was a
Mm-hmm.
turning point in 2020 for many. And what is it about witnessing death like that? Because I specifically didn't show the his
Mm-hmm.
last moment,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because I think I also am very careful. We're in Black History Month, Greg.
Yes,
I'm
yes,
very
yes, yes, yes,
careful
yes.
about um,
Perpetuating. Mm-hmm.
perpetuating and trauma porn. And so
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in this instance, I just wanted to point out the George Floyd. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
showing you the
Mm-hmm.
prequel to his passing. And later on we found out that it's minutes of
Mm-hmm.
a foot being on his neck and so on that led to his passing. But what is it about us seeing that impacts us? What is that emotional pain that we feel it personally and we didn't even know him? I have no clue who he was,
Uh,
but what
but
is
I,
that?
I think it's deep, and I don't want to complicate the conversation. But I think let me locate myself being a Black male and being in a Black body and recognizing shifts in colonialism, recognizing that shift. I
Mm-hmm.
think for a lot of people, they go there because they're looking at the social dynamics and what we continue to have to go through as a people, to be seen and to be heard. And as a result, emerges anti-Black racism. But one of the key things that happen when we have, situations like George Floyd, they impact large communities across the world, but they impact us in silos, right? So that uproar we may experience as an individual, and then we come together. But I think there's a whole social dynamics that is happening, that is at play when we see situations like this, because
Yeah.
it kind of galvanizes us. Um, it goes back to that notion of like just shut up and dribble, where it's not just be remissed and removed. We are human, so it's
Right.
just going back to um, challenging, notions of slavery and racism,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I think as it's happening, all of these things are emerging for a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
As we could
It's
think about it collectively and individually, right?
Yeah. So does this kind of loss also maybe even trigger something that happened to you in the past, and triggers past loss? Like you're seeing it presently happening, and
Hmm.
is our reaction to it maybe not just historically, but
Hmm.
even maybe recently,
Hmm.
that connection is pulling forward.
100%, because I think it's loaded. I think it's a conversation about power and privilege. It's a
Mhm.
conversation about policing. It's a conversation about where we talked about dignity is a loss,
Mhm.
right? So I think there is a lot at play. Kind of talking about the context of what we're talking about as this is happening, right? So if we aren't as a people able to showcase and stand up for our humanity, it's going to be a constant loss for us as a people to be able to stand up. So
Right.
when we're talking about loss, this is a loss that we feel collectively, that if we don't galvanize politically, it's going to impact us individually,
Mhm.
whether beyond gender or race or, personal identity types, right? So for me, uh, it reminded me of why I do this work, in wanting to influence and shift and change policy, and to
Mhm.
be in spaces to have conversations like this,
Mhm.
to bring more equity and equality amongst all nations, races, and creeds, right?
Yeah. I'm gonna jump us ahead a little bit in the
Mhm,
conversation and talk about emotional or psychological responses to
mhm,
grief.
mhm,
In particular, how do we know? How does someone know if grief is becoming overwhelming or
mhm.
unhealthy?
Um, the body keeps score. There is a book that I should tell you of here. I just don't remember the author, but
Mhm.
that is the name of the book. That
I'll
be
look it up and put it in our
Yeah,
caption.
yeah. So depending
So it's
on
called The Body Keeps
the
Score.
body keeps score, I'll
Mhm.
run and get it after if I also could, or I'll make sure that I'll have the exact title and provide some other titles for books that people could refer to in our next episode.
Mhm.
But the body keeps score is a good notion because at some point, depending on the symptoms, because that's what we're going back to. If you're not eating, something's gonna give. If you've been self-medicating, something's gonna give. If you've been having insomnia, something's gonna give. So all of kind of what you're talking about are some of the physical things, right, that are happening. So some of those physical signs are going to be what are going to be telling to, how well you're coping or how well you're doing. So I'm looking at your personal hygiene. Have you been able to do the thing that you once used to do? Are you enjoying anything? Did you used to enjoy sports? Did you used to enjoy going out? Did you have hobbies? Did you have interest? So some of these things are the things that we're scaling to say how much shift has there been. And, based on some of these responses, we'll be able to kind of echo, to highlight, that there should be a shift. Earlier, I talked about what are some of the short-term things that need to be done and what are some of the short-term things that need to be done. For example, an individual might, have a drink or two because they've heard some bad news, but now you're drinking a bottle a day, right? So that's a shift. So we're looking at some of the behavioral changes to try to create a different approach to bring it back to as close to your baseline as possible, with respect to recognizing that this is a journey and the weight of the loss is having a toll on you. And if we don't rein some of these things in, it might lead to some of the things that we talked about before as it relates to mental health or physical impacts.
So in terms of surface level, because this is our intro episode, we'll go into more depth in the next episodes. But in terms of giving people some hope and reassurance, if someone is feeling broken or behind in grief, what would you want them to know?
They're not alone. I think oftentimes we grieve, and I hoped I was able to highlight the fact that when we're talking about grief and loss, there are different signs and symptoms connected to this. So, oftentimes people feel like they're alone, and it leads or may lead to isolation. So I would say they're not alone. I would say recognize their sadness, grief, and sorrow. They're crying. It are signs that something is going on. They may be in a particular stage of grief, and that's okay. I would also say grieving is a journey. And some of the things that I talked about being, whether it be the physical signs, the psychological signs, looking back at things and interests that you used to have. Are you able to work? Are you able to go to school? Are you able to take care of yourself? So really just assessing where you are. It's all a journey, just based on the weight and the level of grief that you have faced. Have, an accountability partner or group or team. There is a lot of stigma connected to loss, depending on the type of loss and kind of, how we experience some of these losses. But being able to be vulnerable and have conversation and really speak to how you're doing is important. And to be given grace, and to be able to be validated that it's okay to feel somewhat shitty, not well. That's okay too. But it's how long do we stay in that place on the journey is important. And, our goal is to really to motivate, to enlighten, to create awareness and to create a shift, one day at a time. As we talk about grief, from a clinical perspective, I look at it from what we call the circle of change, which would be pre-contemplation. You're at a place where you're thinking, maybe I've been in this place too long. And then you start to contemplate change and say, you know what, maybe I want to make a change, whatever that change is for you. And then you take action, and then you do start making some changes and, recognizing that there may be some maintenance and there's some relapse, but we're moving forward on this journey is what is kind of how I would look at it. And kind of helping people move through that continuum. And relapsing is never a negative, like, oh my God, you failed. It's just recognizing that grief has and carries more weight for more individuals, and sometimes it's harder to move for some than it is for others.
And from a clinical lens, do you speak in terms of healing, like the healing process from grief, or what is it? What is the terminology that we're using? Because I want to know, I want to give somebody a kind of a benchmark.
Hmm.
This is the early stages of you're doing better, you're coming out of it. What is that word that you guys use? I could say healing journey. What is it?
For me, I say healing journey.
Mhm,
That's the language that I use, because you used an example earlier where you talked about the individual. You shared, you had just come back from, um, putting your father to rest, and they're like, have you gotten over that stuff already?
mhm,
Right.
mhm,
So to me, that was kind of insensitive. It's not that you get over it. To me, it's a lifetime journey.
mhm,
For some, it isn't, but beyond one day could be a journey, right?
mhm,
So it's really recognizing the road that we're on, to recovery, and the recovery, for some is sooner or later. But with
mhm,
respect to recognizing that I'm meeting you where you're at, I'm not telling you to hurry up and get better, but I see you, and I'm going to support you where you are. I know
mhm,
in my work, working with victims that are impacted by serious crime, I have individual on my roster that I've been with for 7 years, some of which have not been able to go back to work, but they're
mhm,
okay enough to live day in, day out. And
mhm.
that's good enough.
That's progress.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it really depends on the individual, what their
Mhm,
life looks like, and how much the situation derailed them. So you have
mhm,
to think about, either from a metaphoric perspective, am I going to be a train that's on the track, or am I going to be one that's on display? Both are good, because they both bring some element of to somebody, right? So whether
mhm,
we're rolling or not, we're here, we exist, and
mhm.
life may be different because we have to pivot, you know?
Yeah. And I guess last formal kind of question is, what gives you hope when you're working with persons living with, processing, or on the grief journey? What gives you hope?
What gives me hope is, so my sessions are one-on-one. They're for an hour. As I said, it's a journey. So for me, just to be able to offer some peace,
Mhm,
a little bit of peace, a little bit of comfort, a little bit of disruption on how you feel.
mhm,
Um, because I'm super empathetic to recognizing the loss, the weight of the loss, especially
mhm,
when we're unpacking it, depending on the violence and the tragedy.
mhm,
Um, so I'm just really humanizing the individual and just helping them recognize the symptoms and what it could look like as, some of these things morph into different things, and try to provide awareness so that it doesn't become that, but recognizing that if it does, it's still okay, because we're on this journey together, and I'm going to provide as much support clinically as I can to help you continue to live, day in, day out, to get back as close to your baseline as possible. If that doesn't happen, that's still okay, because, I see you, and maybe life is meant to be different for you,
mhm,
right? And I think
mhm,
one of the things that we didn't highlight today is that for a lot of people, um, they memorialize these losses differently,
mhm.
right? So a memorial for some might be a tattoo, it might be a conference, it might be different legacies, right?
Right,
So this brings different inspirations for people that are at that point, right?
right.
So, but that is something that I talk about. How do you continue to keep this person, some part of this person or situation,
Mhm,
as I don't want to use the word benefit, but maybe as a comfort, so that
mhm,
it's not so heavy and daunting as you think
mhm.
about it, when you do, right?
Yeah. Yes. And by way of adding a little bit of resource to those who have been watching, we have a worksheet that you can work on separate from us, just to process anything that may have come up for you in this conversation, because talking about grief, loss, trauma, even if we only skim the surface in this episode, will trigger. Even seeing those images again from COVID or George Floyd may, bring up stuff for you. So here is the worksheet that we have for you to focus in on some elements that may come up for you. I'm going to read for you what the segments are, but you can also freeze frame here as well so that you can see for yourself what are some of the questions that you could possibly be asking as you wrap with us in each episode. So the first part is to do a check-in with yourself. And some of the questions that you may ask here is, what am I feeling right now? Where do I notice this in my body? And what do I need in this moment? And Greg, you can attest that sometimes we just need a hug, and you may live alone. Hug yourself. You know what I mean? Sometimes it may be that, but identify what that is, right? The other thing is to do a little gentle reflection. That is, what loss or grief has been on your mind lately? What has been the hardest thing for you to handle recently? And what has helped you a little? Because as you go through this journey, it's good to identify the good things that can get you over the hump. The other element is support and strength. So who or what makes you feel safe? And when was the last time you felt supported? And how can I ask for help if I need it? I think those questions are important, especially to identify who to surround yourself with as you're going through this process. There may be people and places where you feel good, and being able to tap into that. Like if you went to the park, like I like water, for example. If I see a running water, like a lake, a river, a little stream, a little fall, I immediately feel some form of peace. So being able to identify those things are very helpful. And also looking ahead, what small thing can you do to care for yourself today? And what would kindness towards yourself look like? And what gives you a little bit of hope? So this will stay, of course, on the last slide for each. And I'm also going to put a link in our caption at the end of, this post, so that you can look at the questions yourself and process them each week as we go through this 3-part series on navigating grief. Greg, any last words that you want to leave folks with?
Thank you for giving us both the opportunity to unpack this, vulnerable conversation that's super heavy. We hope that we were candid enough for you to have some takeaway. The hope is really just to help you, anyone that is impacted by grief in some way on their journey, and to really create some awareness and context, and to really remind you that you're not alone.
And that, I think, is a good note to end on. You're not alone. Trust me, you're not alone. We've all experienced it. Even Greg himself, a therapist, can tell you that we've all experienced it on some level on the continuum, some form of loss, some emotional response to this loss. And we're here together. We're here in this space. We're sharing this hour and some minutes together to help to elevate the conversation, help to reassure you that you're not alone, and help to give you some tools as well. So you can come back to this episode when you have a chance. You can also step away if it's too much, and come back, and we'll try to put in the captions resources and so on, and I'll put in there how you can find Greg. I highly recommend him. So, and he doesn't just do, actually, Greg, you can tell them what you focus on now, because I know you work with people who've been dealing with loss through crime and violence and so on. We didn't even touch on that, but that's also part of collective grief.
Yeah, definitely.
Crime every day on TV. And that has an impact on our communities. So
yeah,
tell them a little bit more.
So we can leave that for next time, and I could use that as an intro for our next segment to kind of talk about my work and kind of place myself as to why I kind of, why you were maybe interested in me for this conversation.
Yes.
I do work with individuals that are impacted by grief and loss, but I'll share that at the top of our next segment to kind of just implicate myself within my work.
Yes.
Because maybe some interesting questions will come from me sharing my work and what I do, just to be able to provide some more context to the audience around, like, why am I certified? Why are you having this conversation, right?
Yes.
So we'll leave you guys for something to be interested for next time.
Yes. See you next episode as we talk about navigating grief. Thank you for joining us on another episode of special feature here on Talk the Tings, Navigating Grief. And I thank you, my co-host, Greg and Leslie, for being with us this episode. And we'll have 2 more for you. So look out for it, and feel free to interact with us in the comments when you see the posts on social media, and we'll try to address maybe some questions you may have in the next upcoming episodes. Thanks again, Greg, for your time, and we'll talk soon.
All right, see you again.